included the sinister fact, worth noting, that Aristotle has been named by Charles Murray, co-author of The Bell Curve, as his favourite philosopher. Kant could be condemned for texts he endorsed in his own day, but Aristotle could be condemned for someone admiring him almost 2.5 millennia after his death. It was enough. In this and other ways, the author of the Washington Post piece claimed that Aristotle had laid the groundwork for race science. Furthermore, in the first book of his Politics, Aristotle stands charged with having used taxonomies to justify the exclusion of certain people from civic life. A truly shocking fact in a work written around the year 300 BC. As a result, Aristotle was linked with the alt-right and its chilling embrace of Western civilization. If the Jerusalem pillar of Western civilization has been the Judeo-Christian traditions, then the Athens pillar of Western civilization has been the tradition of philosophy garnered from the ancient Greek and Roman worlds. Any serious attempt to bring the Western tradition low requires both of these pillars to be assaulted simultaneously. To lambast the ancient Greeks as well as the Christian tradition, to go for Aristotle as well as the Bible. So each successive strand of the Western tradition has been picked off in turn. Consider the assault in recent years on the tradition of the Enlightenment. This was the movement, or set of movements, that occurred across Europe around the 18th century and saw some of the greatest leaps forward in human history, providing, among other things, the philosophical bases for the principles of toleration, the utility of reason, and the separation of church and state. The value of this project used to be recognized across the various political sides. Writing in the New Left Review in 1994, the late Eric Hobsbawm was already warning of an interpretation of the Enlightenment as a conspiracy of dead white men in periwigs to provide the intellectual foundation for Western imperialism. Hobsbawm, who was a lifelong apologist for the crimes of communism, understood the importance of protecting the Enlightenment. For, he warned his readers, in spite of its downsides, the Enlightenment provides the only foundation for all the aspirations to build societies fit for all human beings to live in anywhere on this earth. Since writing this, Hobsbawm has become a dead white man himself, so he knows what it feels like. But it is striking that as recently as the 1990s, it was possible for a major figure on the international left to defend the Enlightenment fulsomely. Those who have come after him do not have the same reverence for the foundations of reason that Hobsbawm still possessed. Instead, they have been going through a process of iconoclasm of the most gleeful, ravening kind. One by one, they have sought to bring low the philosophers of the Enlightenment. In June 2020, a statue of Voltaire was removed from in front of the Académie Française in Paris after it was repeatedly vandalized, including being covered in red paint. On that occasion, the charge against the great figure of the French Enlightenment was that he had personally invested in the French East India Company. Others pointed out that he had made a racist comment about Africans in his 1769 work Les Lettres d'Ahmed. One critic claimed a direct linkage between comments of Voltaire's discussions with Frederick the Great and Adolf Hitler's plans for the Third Reich. Writing in Foreign Policy, Nabila Ramdani claimed that Voltaire spread darkness, not enlightenment. Ramdani and other critics of Voltaire ignored entirely his devastating attacks on the immorality of slavery, not least in Candide. So out goes Voltaire, his 1763 treatise on tolerance and all the rest of it, onto the dust heap with everything else. As Voltaire is attacked in France, so every figure of the British Enlightenment has been attacked in Britain. John Locke owned stock in companies that were connected with the slave trade. And so A Letter Concerning Toleration, 1689, has been transformed from one of the great advances of humanist thought into a guilty man's meaningless hypocrisy. One by one, the same techniques have been used. If a person cannot be found to have invested inappropriately in the companies of their day, then their work can be scoured for anything not fitting the mores of the modern world these men helped to create. In How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram X. Kendi attacks Enlightenment philosopher David Hume. He quotes Hume as saying, "I am apt to suspect the Negroes, and in general all the other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white. Such a uniform and constant difference could not happen in so many countries and ages if nature had not made an original distinction between these breeds of men." It is clear, even from Kendi's own footnoting, that he did not stumble upon this quote during a routine read-through of Hume's collected works. He sources it to a chapter titled "A Lousy Empirical Scientist, Reconsidering Hume's Racism," in a book titled "Race and Racism in Modern Philosophy." This work, described by its own publishers as "an innovative and substantial intervention in critical race theory," is intent on answering the question, is modern philosophy racist? People might guess at the answer. Such details matter for several reasons. One is that Kendi cites the aforementioned as though it were a central tenet of Hume's work. In fact, the comment is contained in a single footnote in his essay Of National Characters. It is in all editions of his work and is notorious among Hume scholars. None ever offer any defense of it. If a defense were attempted, it might mention that Hume was of course not a sociologist and had no knowledge of African cultures. More importantly, the sentiment runs entirely contrary to that in so many other parts of his work, not least his denunciation of slavery in Of the Populousness of Ancient Nations. Furthermore, as the scholar Jane O'Grady has persuasively argued, thinkers such as Hume and Kant set the foundations in their work for the arguments that would make racism untenable. They helped to expose its fundamental flaws. For instance, Hume argued that morality is based on humans' natural attunement to one another's feelings and a discomfort at sensing others' discomfort that can be elevated into more impartial justice. Until very recently, Hume was revered, most commonly in the country of his birth, for his radical empiricism, skepticism, and application of reason in his works such as An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, 1758. What seems obvious to the entire world now, especially to these philosophers' critics, was not obvious before Kant and Hume, not in the West, and not anywhere else. None of this stands as a defense, and a solitary footnote is enough to wipe away the attainments and advancements of one of the 18th century's most important thinkers. After the inevitable guilty verdict comes the equally inevitable sentence. In the summer of 2020, a petition got underway to persuade the authorities at Edinburgh University to rename the David Hume Tower on campus because of the philosopher's comments on matters of race. The petition's organizer insisted that we should not be promoting a man who championed white supremacy. a former holder of the David Hume Fellowship at the university, denounced Hume as an unashamed racist. And so the tower, which happened to be the tallest as well as one of the ugliest 1960s buildings on the campus, was promptly renamed. The university's Equality and Diversity Committee and Race Equality and Anti-Racist Subcommittee made the announcement, saying that Hume's comments on race rightly caused distress today and that their work had been energized since the death of George Floyd and the BLM movement. The building would henceforth be known by the poetic moniker 40 George Square. The university subsequently announced a review of all of its buildings and their possible connection to the slave trade so that it could take practical steps to reflect diversity. Pressure immediately grew to remove the statue of Hume on the Royal Mile, and in the meantime various campaigners hung an excerpt from Hume's notorious footnote around his neck so that passers-by could know that he was tarred. Of course, such renamings and re-evaluations might be regarded as being simply part of the normal run of things. Times change, and as the centuries pass, things always emerge in a different light. But one of the oddities of the attack on many of the preeminent figures in Western thought is that the same accusations are levelled at them whatever their views. So, for instance, it has become as common to read denunciations of John Stuart Mill as it has been to read denunciations of Hume. This despite the fact that in his work Mill argued vociferously and explicitly exactly the opposite case to that mentioned by Hume in his one fatal footnote. The case levelled against Mill in recent years has been based on accusations that he was in favour of empire. Such critics fail to take into account Mill's career-long efforts to discredit the racial theories of his day or his belief that education would alter all those things that were claimed to be inherited characteristics. The anti-Millians also fail to address his attitude to the question of the American Civil War as it was going on. Critics have levelled many accusations against Mill, yet nearly all of these have been comprehensively answered in the critical literature, and none of the accusations against him should detract from his consistent and principled defense of racial equality for American Negroes during the war and its aftermath. It is not easy to get things right as they are going on, not least when they are going on in the 19th century, on another continent. But Mill got to the American Civil War about as right as it was possible to get it, worrying of what would happen if the South gained independence, concerned that the African slave trade Britain had spent so much of its treasure abolishing could be brought back, and fearing that the barbarizing consequences of a Southern victory would warrant intervention from Europe. As a result, Mill did more than defend the actions of the North. He would not be a pacifist. As he wrote, "I cannot join with those who cry peace, peace. I cannot wish that this war should not have been engaged in by the North." Mill was not blind to the possibility that it may require a long war to lower the arrogance and tame the aggressive ambition of the slave owners. But, he said, war in a good cause is not the greatest evil which a nation can suffer. War is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest of things. The decayed and degraded state of moral and patriotic feeling which thinks nothing worth a war is worse. It is interesting, incidentally, that the figures who have been most assailed over recent years should so conspicuously be those who are connected with the European Enlightenment. Indeed, it is so conspicuous that there must be a reason. In fact, there are a number of reasons. It is possible that the West's critics presume that the manners and morals of Plato or Aristotle are too far back to be worth assailing with the same tools. The argument, but that was more than 2,000 years ago, may still hold some water, whereas the argument, that was only 250 years ago, may not. But it is also possible, it certainly seems possible, that several things are going on here. The first is the possibility that there is genuinely a reckoning against the thinkers of the Enlightenment that has never before been carried out. That claim could be made, but it would also be inept. For example, nobody who has read Locke is unaware that his concept of tolerance did not extend to Catholics and atheists, just as nobody could read various German thinkers of the 18th and 19th centuries and imagine that all of them were Philo-Semites. No scholar of Hume is unaware of that one footnote. It seems right to assume that there is something else going on. One possibility is that all these thinkers were living and writing at a time when what have become the two great sins of the West, slavery and empire, were going on, and that a reckoning on this is overdue. But being alive at the same time as other events does not make someone central to the darkest aspects of those occurrences. Yet that is the claim of the new assailants of the Enlightenment. For instance, the British writer and academic Kehinde Andrews claimed in a public debate in 2021 that a defense of liberalism is the worst possible thing you want to do, because liberalism is the problem. It is the Enlightenment values which really cement racial prejudice. If you actually think about all the Enlightenment scholars, all of them had a racial theory with white people at the top and black people at the bottom. It was universal across all the different countries. It was such an important part of the Enlightenment that it gets embedded into the way that we think in a way that we don't even think about it as racist. So we take someone like Immanuel Kant's universal values of human rights, which is deeply racist, and then we wonder why the world is still racist. Aside from Andrews's attack on both the Enlightenment and liberalism, the most interesting aspect of this analysis is how remarkably ahistorical it is. As the historian Jeremy Black, among others, has noted, there was a very significant debate going on throughout the same period as the Enlightenment. It was a debate that people did not need to engage in, but that was going on beneath them all the same. That is, the debate between monogenesis and polygenesis. Those who defended monogenesis believed that human beings, despite their racial differences, all came from the same genetic stock. The followers of polygenesis, by contrast, believed that the different races were not racially connected. It was a debate that continued throughout the 1700s and after. America's founding fathers were caught up in it, but even the greatest among them did not have settled views on the matter. After attacking David Hume, Kendi points out that Thomas Jefferson seemed to believe that all men are created equal, but he goes on to fault Jefferson because Thomas Jefferson never made the anti-racist declaration, all racial groups are equals. While segregationist ideas suggest a racial group is permanently inferior, assimilationist ideas suggest a racial group is temporarily inferior. It would be hazardous to affirm that, equally cultivated for a few generations, the Negro would not become equal, Jefferson once wrote, in assimilationist fashion. This assault on Jefferson is emblematic of the uncharitable and ignorant approaches the critics take. The source of the quote is a private letter of Jefferson to the Marquis de Chastellux, written in June 1785. It is not a clause in a constitution or part of a declaration. It is not something that Jefferson toured the country preaching to people. he is simply turning over in his mind, in a letter to a fellow philosopher and military general, one of the unanswered questions of their day. Perhaps because it does not fit his effort to portray Jefferson in the most unsympathetic possible light, Kendi does not bother to quote what Jefferson writes in the same letter, but it is interesting. Jefferson writes, "I believe the Indian, then, to be in body and mind equal to the white man. I have supposed the black man in his present state might not be so, but it would be hazardous to affirm that, equally cultivated for a few generations, he would not become so." Rather than a racist assertion, Thomas Jefferson wrote what a defender of blacks would say to a skeptic. He's recommending against thinking the thing Kendi accuses him of. It is dishonest in a multiplicity of ways to claim that because of this fact figures such as Jefferson must essentially be dethroned and discarded. It would have been an unusual figure who lived through past centuries and saw every part of them with all the varieties of insight that the rear-view mirror provides. It would have been an uncommon figure in the 1770s who, without making it their special area of study, or even if they had, could have come to the conclusion that peoples they had rarely if ever met, or even read about, were without doubt from the same genetic stock as themselves. It also assumes that the issues that exercise us today must de facto have been the same issues that should have preoccupied not just some people, but all people in the times before our own. Perhaps the thinkers of the Enlightenment should have preoccupied themselves exclusively with the issues that preoccupy us today, but they were busy with other things. Much of Voltaire's energies were expended against the clergy of his day. Much of Hume's energy was spent, like other thinkers of the era, devising ways for society to emerge from a period of superstition and corruption. Kant's energies were spent attempting to divine and delineate a universal ethic. Might they have spent more time applying themselves to what was happening on continents they never visited? Perhaps. Might they have applied themselves to questions of rights among people they had never met? Quite possibly. But it is a high demand to make, and a presumptuous one. Even today's champions of speaking out have not spoken out on every injustice. The number of human rights violations that American television host Joy Reid, for example, has not spoken out about must be literally immeasurable. In addition, in our own age, the developed West sees it as wrong to talk of superior or inferior people. But in the 18th century, it was not unusual to compare one civilization to another and categorize them as superior or inferior to each other. If we have a special abhorrence for such trends today, then it is because we live after the 20th century. An 18th century philosopher in Königsberg did not know everything that we know now, nor did he know nothing. It does not mean that we have the right to condemn him, teach students only about his errors, or fool ourselves, for the sake of ease, into thinking that we have nothing to learn from him. There is one other possibility to explain the oddity of the Enlightenment thinkers ending up so prominently in the firing line of our era. And that is this. The European Enlightenments were the greatest leap forward for the concept of objective truth. The project that Hume and others worked away on was to ground an understanding of the world in verifiable fact. Miracles and other phenomena that had been a normal part of the world of ideas before their era suddenly lost all their footholds. The age of reason did not produce the age of Aquarius, but it put claims that were ungrounded in fact on the back foot for the best part of 2 centuries. By contrast, what has been worked away at in recent years has been a project in which verifiable truth is cast out. In its place comes that great Oprahism, my truth. The idea that I have my truth and you have yours makes the very idea of objective truth redundant. It says that a thing becomes so because I feel it to be so, or say that it is so. At its most extreme, it is a reversion to a form of magical thinking. Precisely the thinking that the Enlightenment thinkers chased out. And perhaps that is why the Enlightenment thinkers have become such a focus for assault. Because the system they set up is antithetical to the system that is being constructed today. A system entirely opposed to the idea of rationalism and objective truth. A system dedicated to sweeping away everyone from the past as well as the present who does not bow down to the great God of the present. Me. Why do their gods not fall? Yet there are many oddities in all of this. Kant, Hume, Jefferson, Mill, Voltaire, and everyone else connected to racism, empire, or slavery must fall, and yet a strange selection of historical figures does not. And in this fact, we get to the roots of something that is happening in the anti-Western moment. In Highgate, in London, one of the largest monuments in the cemetery is a great bust on top of a huge stone pillar. On the front are quotes from the Communist Manifesto, "Workers of all lands unite," and from the theses on Feuerbach, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." The man whose tomb this is, paid for by the Communist Party of Britain in the 1960s, is of course Karl Marx. To this day, it remains a place of pilgrimage for people who think that Marx changed the world in a good way. All have their own spin for dealing with the fact of the roughly 100 million people who were killed in trying to change the world along Marx's lines. Yet it stands there still, and there have been no serious efforts to topple it or destroy the bust. Occasionally it has been daubed in red paint, with such vandalism always condemned by cultural and political figures alike. But through the events of recent years, there have been no online petitions or crowd efforts to pull it down and kick it into a nearby river. There may be a reason for that, of course, which is that it is a tombstone, and even the most doctrinaire people might find it distasteful to desecrate a grave. Yet the monument in Highgate is not the only memorial to Marx or Marxism that stands. As recently as 2016, Salford University unveiled a new memorial on its campus. The huge bust of Friedrich Engels, co-author of the Communist Manifesto, was made into a feature of campus life, in part to commemorate the fact that Marx and Engels used to drink in a nearby pub when they lived in the area in the 1840s. The university authorities paid for the vast 5-meter-tall sculpture as a tribute to the two men. As recently as 2018, on the 200th anniversary of his birth, a vast new, larger-than-life statue of Marx was unveiled in the town of Trier on the southwest of Germany, just near the borders with Luxembourg, Belgium and France. The 14-foot-tall bronze statue was donated by the authorities in China, and the hundreds of guests at the unveiling included a delegation from the Chinese Communist Party. It seems as though a connection with Marx or Marxism is no ethical problem, perhaps even a plus. In April 2021, when students at the University of Liverpool forced the university authorities to rename a building named after the 19th century Prime Minister William Gladstone because of his father's links with slavery, they renamed the hall after a civil rights campaigner and lifelong Communist Party member called Dorothy Kuya. There is no special effort to eradicate, problematize, decolonize, or otherwise act in an anti-racist manner against the legacy of Karl Marx and his circle. And this is strange, because as anybody who has read the work of Marx will know, especially anyone who has read his letters with Engels, Marx's reputation by the lights of our own age ought to be toast by now. Consider the racism in Marx's letters to Engels, where the two great communists converse privately about the issues of their day. Here is a letter from Marx to Engels, written in July 1862. The Jewish N-word Lassalle, who, I'm glad to say, is leaving at the end of this week, has happily lost another 5,000 thalers in an ill-judged speculation. It is now quite plain to me, as the shape of his head and the way his hair grows also testify, that he is descended from the Negroes who accompanied Moses' flight from Egypt, unless his mother or paternal grandmother interbred with an N-word. Now this blend of Jewishness and Germanness on the one hand and basic Negroid stock on the other must inevitably give rise to a peculiar product. The fellow's importunity is also N-word-like. Of course, this is not a nice way to speak about anybody, but a charitable interpretation, such as has been denied to David Hume, might say that this is just one ugly thing said by Marx in a private letter, and that we shouldn't judge him harshly on it. Yet this is not the only occasion that such a sentiment came from Marx's pen. Here is another letter to Engels, written 4 years later, in 1866, in which Marx describes a recent work he believes Engels might benefit from. By this stage, both men are aware of the discoveries of Charles Darwin, whose work on the origins of species, natural selection, and much more were of course unavailable to the philosophers of the Enlightenment. Marx is interested in Pierre Trémaux and his Origine et transformation de l'homme et des autres êtres, Paris, 1865. By now, the monogenesis argument, that is, that human beings are all related and are not different species, was winning the intellectual war. Frederick Douglass and others had made highly persuasive and ultimately successful interventions into the debate. And yet, even now, still, Marx is playing around with the polygenesis argument. As he tells Engels of Trémaux's work, in spite of all the shortcomings I have noted, it represents a very significant advance over Darwin. E.g., he spent a long time in Africa, he shows that the common Negro type is only a degeneration of a far higher one. Perhaps this was just a blind spot for Marx. Perhaps he had a problem with black people, but not with other groups. Here is Marx in another letter to Engels, where he manages to get on to the subject of Jews. The expulsion of a leper people from Egypt, at the head of whom was an Egyptian priest named Moses. Lazarus, the leper, is also the basic type of the Jew. Of course, there is another way in which this could also be defended. It might be said that Marx was not writing for public consumption in these letters. His reflections on the degenerative nature of the common Negro and the leprous nature of the Jewish people are ugly, certainly, but they are private reflections in a private letter written privately to a friend, like the letter that Thomas Jefferson sent to the Marquis de Chastellux. But the problem with Marx is that he didn't just keep his racism to his private correspondence with his co-author on the Communist Manifesto. In 1853, in one of his pieces for the New York Tribune, Marx wrote of the Balkans that it had the misfortune to be inhabited by a conglomerate of different races and nationalities, of which it is hard to say which is the least fit for progress and civilization. In 1856, he could be found writing in the same paper that we find every tyrant backed by a Jew, and claiming that there exists always a handful of Jews to ransack pockets. Starting from the time of Jesus and the throwing of the moneylenders out of the temple, Marx tells his audience that the loan-mongering Jews of Europe do only on a larger and more obnoxious scale what many others do on one smaller and less significant. But it is only because the Jews are so strong that it is timely and expedient to expose and stigmatize their organization. And these proto-Hitlerian views are not from a single period of Marx's life. Rather, they are consistent throughout it. Over a decade earlier, in 1843, Marx writes in On the Jewish Question, "What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. Money is the jealous god of Israel, in face of which no other god may exist." Well, you might say, perhaps Marx simply didn't like Jews very much, except that he didn't seem to like other races very much either, and had just as little respect for their great histories as he did for the history of the Jews. In 1853, he is telling his audience in America, Indian society has no history at all, at least no known history. And while Marx is simultaneously damning and utterly ignorant of Indian civilization, he does seem to favour British rule in India. The question, he says, is not whether the English had a right to conquer India, but whether we are to prefer India conquered by the Turk, by the Persian, by the Russian, to India conquered by the Briton. One role of Britain in India, Marx asserts, is to lay the material foundations of Western society in Asia. He is inclined to think that they can do it. For although Marx notes that other civilizations had overrun India, these earlier barbarian conquerors had been unequal to the task, whereas the British were the first conquerors superior and therefore inaccessible to Hindu civilization. Still, Marx may have been anti-black, anti-Semitic, anti-Indian, pro-colonialist, and racist both in public and in private, but at least he cannot be connected with the other great sin of the West. Alas, as though proving to posterity that Marx could get every issue wrong, here he is writing about slavery in 1847, ahead of the American Civil War, and already very much on the wrong side of that conflict. Slavery is an economic category like any other. Marx weighed up the bad side and what he called the good side of slavery, and he found a lot of good to say about it. Without slavery, North America, the most progressive of countries, would be transformed into a patriarchal country. Wipe North America off the map of the world and you will have anarchy, the complete decay of modern commerce and civilization. Cause slavery to disappear and you will have wiped America off the map of nations. Why is it worth reeling off this incomplete list of what are, in our own era, an almost clean sweep of offences? Not simply because they demonstrate that the most significant figure in the history of left-wing thought, indeed its genesis figure and prophet, perhaps even its God, was guilty of every one of the vices levelled at all non-Marxists in the West. But in any analysis, Marx was far worse than any of the people who, largely leftist campaigners, have spent recent years lambasting. Marx's anti-Semitism is more noxious than Immanuel Kant's. His career-long record of racism makes a single footnote in the work of David Hume look very slight. His language of superior and inferior races was of a kind that progressive thinkers such as John Stuart Mill already abhorred, and worse than anything Thomas Jefferson engaged in. The only defence that might be made of him by his defenders and disciples is that he was a man of his time, that Marx lived in the 19th century and therefore held on to a number of the era's most unpleasant attributes. And yet this defence is packed with explosives waiting to go off in the face of anyone hoping to use them. First, because who is not a man of their own time? Every person whose reputation has been brought down in the cultural revolution of recent years was also a man or woman of his or her own time. So why should this excuse be successful when used in defense of Marx, yet dismissed when used in defense of Voltaire or Locke? With Marx, there is another problem in his defense, which is that for his defenders, he is not simply another thinker. He is not even to be compared with Hume or the sage of Königsberg. For his followers, Marx is the last, or, depending on how you count it, the originating prophet. He was not just a thinker or a sage. He was the formulator of a world revolutionary movement, a movement that claimed to know how to reorder absolutely everything in human affairs in order to arrive at a utopian society. A utopian society that has never been achieved and has cost many millions of lives in not being achieved, but that activists across the West still dream of instituting next time. Always next time. It may be said that a prophet should be held to a higher standard than a mere philosopher, antiquarian, or botanist. A 2019 biography of Marx was reviewed in the New York Times under the headline, "Karl Marx, Prophet of the Present." The paper's reviewer, while noting in passing some of Marx's less seemly comments about Jews, concluded that the work makes the case for taking Marx seriously today as a pragmatic realist as well as a messianic visionary who never lost his belief in a redemptive future. Which is a beautiful idea, of course, and entirely divorced not just from every detail of the consequences, but from the reality of the man in question. What becomes clear in analysing the differences between the treatment of Marx and the treatment of almost every other thinker of the West is that the game is worse than inconsistent. It exists to cut a swath through every thinker or historical figure in the Western tradition, to lambast them for holding on to one or more of the attitudes of their time that our own age holds to be abhorrent, and, at the same time, to ensure that figures whose work is helpful in pulling apart the Western tradition, even to the point of demanding revolution to overturn it, are never treated to this same ahistorical and retributive game. Marx is protected because his writings and reputation are useful for anyone wishing to pull down the West. Everybody else is subjected to the process of destruction because their reputations are useful for holding up the West. After all, remove every other philosopher from the field, take down all their monuments and the tributes to them, and ensure that their thought is taught primarily and ahistorically as a story of racism and slavery, and what is left standing in the Western tradition? For anyone who doubts that this is the game that is being engaged in, perhaps one other example may suffice. Among the modern thinkers who have the most impact on contemporary thought, almost none sits higher than Michel Foucault, 1926-84. He remains the world's most cited scholar across an array of disciplines. His work on sexuality, and especially on the nature of power, has endeared him to generations of students. His ideas make him the most important name to drop for any scholar involved in the activist studies of recent decades. For black studies, queer studies, and others, he is the indispensable figure. Among the reasons is that, taken in its totality, his work is one of the most sustained attempts to undermine the system of institutions that had made up part of the Western system of order. Foucault's obsessive analysis of everything through a quasi-Marxist lens of power relations diminished almost everything in society into a transactional, punitive, and meaningless dystopia. Among those to push Foucault's work from an early stage was Edward Said. The two would inevitably have been attracted to each other because underneath the work of both men was an effort to destabilize, if not deconstruct, the idea of the Western nations as having almost anything good to be said for them. It is always unpleasant, as well as unwise, for thinkers to lambast each other because of the habits of their personal lives. The personal is not always political, and is certainly not always philosophical. Yet, in March 2021, a most interesting fact emerged about the personal life of Foucault. During an interview, his fellow philosopher, Guy Sorman, revealed a fact that had long been rumoured. Sorman revealed that in the late 1960s, when Foucault was living near Tunis, Foucault would have sex with the local children. Sorman said that on a visit to Sidi Bou Said near Tunis, he witnessed young children running after Foucault, asking him for the money he offered other children before raping them. According to Sorman, these boys of 8, 9, or 10 years of age would have money thrown at them by Foucault, who would arrange to meet them late at night at the usual place. The usual place turned out to be the local cemetery, where Foucault would rape the children on the gravestones. As Sorman said, the question of consent wasn't even raised. Foucault would not have dared to do this in France, according to Sorman, but there was a colonial dimension to this, a white imperialism. One of the many oddities of these revelations is that, to date, they seem to have done nothing to dent Foucault's reputation. Nor has the fact that, along with other French intellectuals, he once signed a letter recommending the age of consent in his country be lowered to 12. His work continues to be cited, his books continue to be published, and there is no significant campaign to have them pulled. Indeed, a final, previously unpublished volume in his History of Sexuality was published after these revelations came out. The repercussions of Foucault's theories continue to be felt, and nowhere has there been any recantation by his disciples in disciplines across America or anywhere else because of the revelations of racially motivated child rape. Like the double standard over Marx's racism, this fact is suggestive, for it would surely be different if it had worked the other way around. If one of the 20th century's great conservative thinkers had been revealed to have travelled to the developing world in order to rape young boys on a tombstone in a graveyard at night, it might be considered suggestive. The political left would likely be unwilling to let the issue slide by completely, nor would they be willing to pass up the opportunity to extrapolate some extra lessons. They might say that this habit was revealing of a wider conservative mindset, that it revealed the paedophilic, rapist, racist tendencies at the heart of traditional Western thought. They might even try to point out that a whole cultural movement or societal tendency was tarred by association with this nocturnal and noxious habit. But with Foucault, no such thing has happened. He remains on his throne. His work continues to spill out, and nobody to date seems to think there is anything especially telling about one of the founding icons of the anti-Westernism of our time having found personal pleasure in purchasing native children of foreign countries to satisfy his sexual desires. It is in such omissions and double standards that something crucial can be discerned, which is that what is happening in the current cultural moment is not simply an assertion of a new moral vision, but the attempted imposition of a political vision on the West, one in which only specific figures, whom the West had felt proud of, are brought down. Meanwhile, those figures who have been most critical of the Western traditions of culture and the free market are spared the same treatment, as though in the hope that when everyone else is brought low, the only figures who will still remain on their pedestals, both real and metaphorical, are those figures who were most critical of the West, meaning that the only people left to guide us would be the people who will guide us in the worst possible directions. Woke churches. Ordinarily, at a time of great cultural flux, people might hope to find solace in institutions that have weathered similar storms before. In the Western tradition, few institutions have held on to a truth and proclaimed that truth for as sustained a period as the Christian churches. For 2,000 years they have held themselves out as the possessors of a sacred flame, one with a gospel, teachings,